In this lesson, we're going to be talking about hypervisors. What is a hypervisor? Well, a hypervisor is a piece of software that actually provides access to hardware in a virtualized way. And there's a couple of different types of hypervisors. And you'll see here diagrams of the two types of hypervisors. The first type of hypervisor is where the hypervisor runs directly on top of the hardware. So, for example, VMware's ESX server or Microsoft's Hyper-V hypervisor both run directly on top of the hardware. If we wanted to go back a ways and think about where virtualization actually began with IBM and their mainframe products, we would have things like CPCMS, for example, and later ZVM. Those are hypervisors that run directly on top of the hardware. And then on top of the hypervisor, you would install an operating system or multiple operating systems, probably multiple operating systems. Otherwise, there's not really much point in having the hypervisor to begin with. You would just install the OS directly on top of the hardware. So server-based virtualization solutions would primarily be Type 1 hypervisors. Now, a Type 2 hypervisor is probably one you're more familiar with, and it's certainly one that we've looked at here previously. A Type 2 hypervisor is where you install your operating system on top of the hardware. My example here would be I've got my PC and I've got Mac OS installed on top of it, and then I've got a hypervisor that runs on top of that. In this case, or in my case, I've got Parallels, which is my hypervisor that runs on top of my operating system. So I've got Parallels as a hypervisor, and my hypervisor runs on top of my operating system. Now, again, same thing here with the example previously. I could have multiple operating systems running on top of the hypervisor. The other thing about the Type 2 hypervisor is I could actually run multiple hypervisors. So I could have Parallels running on top of Mac OS, and I could also have VirtualBox running on top of Mac OS. So I've got one operating system, two hypervisors, and then I could have multiple operating systems running inside those hypervisors. So I could have an instance of Windows XP running inside of Parallels. I could have a Windows 7 instance running inside of Parallels. And then inside of VirtualBox, I could have Linux Mint, and I could have Ubuntu, and I could have Backtrack. So I could have, for example, 5 operating systems, assuming I had enough memory and disk space to support all of those. I could have 5 operating systems running inside of 2 hypervisors running on top of one operating system. You can see where it gets a little complicated, but also opens up doors for a lot of interesting possibilities. Now, as I've mentioned in another lesson, the origins of hypervisors actually go back to the mid-1960s, where IBM was doing research at their Cambridge Scientific Center, and they came up with this idea where they could run multiple operating systems on top of one piece of hardware, which was one of their mainframes. And over several years, they refined that ability until the early 1970s when they were doing full virtualization, because they ended up adding a piece of hardware that gave them the ability to do virtual memory. So now we're at the point where PCs have really almost caught up to where the mainframes were 40 years ago, 40 or 50 years ago. And we've got all of these solutions like KVM on Linux, Citrix Zen Server, Oracle VM Server, VMware ESX, ESXi, and of course Microsoft's Hyper-V. So there's all of these different types of virtualization software that's out there, and all of that software would be an example of a hypervisor of one sort or another, whether it's a type 1 hypervisor or a type 2 hypervisor.